Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Astrid Edwards. I am a bibliophile. I am the host of the Garrett Writers on Writing, and my favorite thing to do is to talk to writers and authors about what they do. In this series of chats with the State Library of Victoria, so far we've spoken to Christos Chalkas, Jess Hill, Jennifer Mills, and Kylie Finlay. And today it is my great pleasure to bring you Jamila Rizvi, who we will be chatting with today. Two small pieces of housekeeping before I introduce Jamila. This will only go for half an hour, so get your questions in quick. You can enter your questions through the Slido function as you are watching on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, Jamila, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, Jamila, you don't really need any introduction, but just to put it out there, you are the editor-at-large of Future Women, which is a fantastic title. You have a regular column in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and of course you are a speaker, a presenter, and an author of several books. Welcome.
Thank you. I sound more impressive when you read that out, but at the moment I don't speak to anyone except my laptop like this.
You speak via Zoom. Now, Jamila, we first met when I interviewed you for the Garrett. And of course, before I met you, the very first time, I actually read your book, Not Just Lucky. And this book came out 3 years ago. And I really wanted to bring it up again today because it's a work that has stayed with me. And, you know, one of the first things I learned about you after I met you, Jamila, was that you represent everything that you write in this book, right? You are all about supporting women in the workplace and gender equality. So to kick off our discussion today, can you give us like the 20-second introduction to Not Just Lucky?
Yeah, sure. I feel like I'm going back in time talking to you about this book. Not Just Lucky came for me, the concept, out of spending a lot of time working in politics in very much a male-dominated environment, and then going into women's media immediately after, which was like exclusively chicks. And there were so many different things about those two working different environments, and there was a whole lot of structural sexism and things that held women back. But one of the things I noticed that I don't think I quite believed before doing the research for this book was that the women were simply less confident. And I didn't believe that that lack of confidence came from some innate biological function. And I did the research and it turns out it doesn't. And I wanted to understand where it came from. And the answer, if you want to know, folks, is socialization in a deeply patriarchal world. But at the time, I wanted to understand that better. And through understanding that better, my own confidence grew. So I wanted to be able to share that with other women.
And you did that so well. Now, we find ourselves in 2020. It's 3 years since the publication of your first book. And I'm not sure, history will tell for us, but I'm not sure if we've witnessed as much change in 3 years as we normally do, shall we say. And I'm really interested today in your observations of where we find us now in 2020 about gender, about equality in the workplace, equality in the home, given what we have just experienced, which is lockdown, social isolation, a pandemic, health scare. And now as we come out of that, we are going into a recession.
Mm-hmm. And let me address that in a couple of parts. I think the first one is I wrote the final chapter of my book. I wrote the conclusion the week after Donald Trump was elected and it was victorious over Hillary Clinton. And I had actually, at the time I was writing for the News Limited press, and I had been tasked the night before with writing an article on what Hillary Clinton's election would mean for women all over the globe. So I was diligently sitting down in the middle of the day, watching the election coverage, typing my little article. And as I watched the news come in, I kind of went, oh, and started deleting my article and switching to alcohol instead. I knew this was going to happen. Excuse me a moment. Yes, it's going to be my small child. What is it? Hey, what did I make the rule?
I was going to make 3 knots.
Yeah.
But
Hey. Look. There is Astrid.
Hi.
And Mummy's doing
Hey, Rafi, I live in here still.
Can you give me a break, please?
I made 2 knots far on together, and then I was going to make a 3 knot.
Yeah.
The 3 knot connected to the second knot. I made the knots closer together.
I want you to do 100 knots and come back.
100.
100. I apologize.
Jamila, that is excellent, loving and supportive parenting. And also that is actually kind of what we're talking about, not that we planned that, about gender equality in the home and how people work full time and actually still remain beautiful parents.
Yeah, so to finish off where I was at, the election of Trump, I actually wrote that chapter and my editors sent me back to rewrite it because it was depressing. I'd written this book that was empowering and uplifting, and then in that moment I couldn't write a happy conclusion. And while I rewrote the conclusion to be optimistic, the results of what's happened since have not been remotely positive.
No.
And I think perhaps my initial conclusion was the right one, and that makes me really sad. Now, to the present moment, as you can see, working from home has a number of challenges, and those challenges are gendered. One of the things that is top of mind for me at the moment is how women recover out of this recession, and we're already seeing it being labelled a she-cession. That is that traditionally recessions have tended to hurt men harder and for longer. This is going to be quite different. Despite the fact that women are the majority of frontline essential workers and the majority of healthcare workers, who of course are remaining employed, they are also the majority of people being unemployed. And that's because women still dominate low-skilled, casual, and part-time positions. Jobs that you can be sacked from really quickly. Jobs where you can be laid off very quickly and where the business can be prioritized over you and your security. So it is going to be pretty scary, I think, over the coming little while. We just saw a few days ago that women's workforce participation has already gone backwards in Australia. It's dropped 2.9 percentage points as of May. That doesn't sound a lot, and it's only about 1% more than men's, but it is close to double the drop in men's participation. And if you put that in numbers rather than percentages, we're talking about 250,000 women. So that is not an insignificant figure. On the flip side of that is the kind of mixed emotions I think I'm having about the unpaid work that women are doing during isolation and during the pandemic. During this period, women have picked up the majority of extra childcare responsibilities, homeschooling responsibilities, and unpaid work in the home. That's all the cooking and cleaning that a lot of women, I think, particularly professional women, were able to hire help for before, had the support of a childcare system, had the support of wonderful teachers and after school care, and suddenly that wasn't an option. And while men have stepped up more than they were doing before the pandemic, they haven't stepped up as much as women have. So while we've all been talking about the glory of flexible work and maybe we'll understand parents and the requirements of carers better and that will be good for women, that sounds very nice, but the reality seems to be that that's not quite right, that our recovery from this pandemic and our recovery out of recession is going to be far more difficult for women. And we may well go backwards when it comes to workforce participation and gender equality.
That is a really stark thing to hear you say, the idea that we could go backwards because of what started as a health crisis, but has very much become an economic and gendered crisis as it continues. Now, obviously, Jamila, you are a writer across all different forms, long form works of nonfiction, as well as short, snappy articles in the media. Words are your friend and words mean a lot to you. Why? Like, for you, what is the power of words and why do you choose to make that your career, the tools of your trade, so to speak?
That is a big question. I mean, I choose it because there's power in words, right? I am not a physically strong person. I'm not even a physically well person. I'm quite an unwell person and have a number of disabilities. I'm never going to be dominant in this world because of my physical strength. I am never going to be able to communicate and have a power that is gifted to me in the same way it is to people with a whole lot more money, for example. I didn't inherit wealth like Donald Trump did that gives you an automatic platform. And power for me is going to come through the written and spoken word. And I think growing up with an English teacher mother and a father who worked in government policy and used to talk to me a lot about the importance of the simplicity of language, not just those beautiful flourishing sentences I read in all the classics as a kid, but simple language, simple but effective and impactful language that gets a point across to people. I think for me, that's what words are about. And that's why I'm so interested in them and commanding them in a way that makes people feel included rather than excluded.
I've developed a terrible habit in my old age. I highlight books when I read them, particularly nonfiction books. And as I was preparing to talk with you today, Jamila, I went back and had a look at what I highlighted the first time I read Not Just Lucky. Terrible habit. But this quote, I think, is what I wanted to speak to you about today. And on page 37 of the trade paperback, you say, creative and storytelling industries have tremendous power and opportunity. They can help show children our society as it should be, rather than simply how it is. That made an impression on me back then, and it still resonates with me now. You're a mum, obviously. We just met Rafi. In this time, how have you been using words or books to talk to your child about why he can't go to school and why he can't do certain things? How are you using that simplicity of language to explain?
I suppose in a lot of different ways. My son's a really inquisitive little kid. He's also a bothersome kid, so prepare for him to come back. And he had a lot of questions about why he wasn't going to school, about why he wasn't going to ballet and swimming, and why we weren't touching the supermarket trolley, and all sorts of different things. And then when we started talking to him about coronavirus, he then wanted to know what the virus looked like and what it smelt like and if it had any friends, and quite difficult questions, I have to say, for someone who didn't finish year 10 science. And I really did struggle with how to speak to him about this, not so much about the safety aspect and the behavior aspect, but I think the challenge for me was helping him grieve. And that's a big word for a little person, right? It is a big word. But we as adults have all gone through a period of genuine grief for the lives that we used to live and the uncertainty of the life that lies ahead of us. I think we've also experienced a degree of anticipatory grief here in Australia, where we thought the number of deaths in our country were going to be so much greater than they were. And then, of course, there's a huge number of people who are grieving lost jobs, lost income, and worrying about their future. Little kids have grief too. And the fact that my little boy is grieving the fact he can't go to ballet doesn't make that grief unimportant. And so I think a lot of my discussions with him early on were around recognizing his sadness and saying it's okay to feel sad, it's okay to be disappointed, but then also trying with my language to move him to a new place, which was a place of feeling powerful, in control of the world, knowing that there were things he could do to work hard against this virus. And he is like proper fist pumping in the air, we're beating the virus, mummy, every couple of days. And that's how I want him to feel. I want him to feel that he has made some sacrifices, and those sacrifices are really sad and really rough, but there's a reason for them. And I'm trying to help him to see that that reason was a meaningful one.
That's such an important lesson. It's so lovely that you're giving Rafi those words. And also fist bumping the virus. That's awesome. Jamila, I know that you have kept yourself very busy during the time that we have, all been at home. And we are coming out of that now. And I know you are now an expert sourdough baker, amongst other things. But I like to think I know you relatively well, and I'm pretty sure that you have been beavering away on quite a few different writing projects. And I wanted to ask, and I know that you won't better say much about it, but I know that you were thinking of writing for children. Is that true?
Yes. In fact, some of what I just spoke to you about then is going to form the basis of a new children's book that I'm doing with Penguin. And look, I can say this now that I've signed the contract. I had no idea what I was doing. Having consumed a lot of children's literature when I was a kid, and consumed a whole lot more again now reading to my son over the last 5 years of his life. Look, I know children's books, and I think I felt like an expert, you know what I mean? But understanding children's books and what works for children and how to write for children is so much more complex than knowing where the green sheep is, right? And I've definitely learned that over the past little while. I handed in some truly horrendous drafts to Penguin, and I'm sure they regretted their decision a few times. But they have been magnificent, working really closely with me, talking about where I have written over the heads of children, where I needed to simplify, where I needed to give validation to their feelings more or less. I think less often in my case. I get a bit deep on the feelings. And I think one of the things that's really stayed with me through this process relates to what you asked earlier, which is the power of a single word and changing a word, because when you're writing a book like Not Just Lucky, you've got 90,000 words to play with. It's okay if a couple of them aren't great. But if you
don't tell anyone.
it's all great. If you're working with a children's book and you've got 700 words to play with, every word has to work really, really hard. And you do stay up at night going, is the word ruined right? Is ruined the word that I want to use there? Is that above the head of a 4 or 5 year old, or is that a word that they'd use and understand? Am I capturing the feeling right? And you change it backwards and forwards 20 times. So I've definitely learned something in that regard, and it's been an absolute joy working on that children's book, as well as some other projects that I have got coming along. It has been a very busy working isolation for me, and I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to be working during this period, because so many people I know are not.
It is a privilege to be working now and to have a job that can be done via Zoom.
Yeah, that's so true. And simply the fact that I could bunker down in my house and kind of not see anyone other than the people who lived here, as emotionally difficult as that was, I was able to keep myself physically safe. I also live in a house where we've got space inside. We're not living on top of one another. The realities of privilege, I think, during this period have been completely overwhelming. I do a podcast called The Briefing with Southern Cross Oz Stereo, and in one of our episodes we looked at the experience of homeless people during the pandemic, and it sounds really obvious, but it came home again and again and again, the enormous privilege of having somewhere safe to go to. And I think, you know, a similar message could be applied to women who are at the moment living with violent partners and for whom staying home is not safe.
Absolutely. I had the pleasure of speaking to Jess Hill on this series for the State Library a few weeks ago, and she has some incredible observations and then data to explain what might be happening now that will only turn up in the stats much later on. Jamila, you spoke about Rafi's grief as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, about, you know, how his life has changed. I'm interested in kind of pursuing that idea, but with the adults. I mean, the grief that each of us feel as an adult is going to be different based on the privilege that we have, and from what space and, you know, income level and everything else that we experienced, social isolation and the lockdown while it lasted in Australia. Can you speak to that, and specifically the kind of new social norms or things that we're kind of developing out of that as adults?
Look, I think it's impacted everyone so differently, and even just in my very close circle, even in the individuals who live in my household, it's impacted them so differently. My mother-in-law was visiting from the United States when the pandemic hit. She made the decision not to go home, so she moved in with us. I can only imagine the trauma for her, knowing she was on the other side of the world from her husband, that she was probably physically safe here, but that she wanted to be somewhere else. Her first granddaughter was born during the pandemic, and I think hearing that news and watching that news from the other side of the ocean would have been incredibly hard on her. Plus she had to live with us. That can't have been much fun. It was a challenge for us as well, you know, moving in with people you're not used to living with is hard. My husband really missed the things like the beach and surfing. We live a long way from the water here in inner city Melbourne, and he missed being able to jump in the car and go down the beach on the weekends. And I think that really hit him quite hard, to the point that he's now ferociously surfing because it's almost like he's trying to make up for lost time. And for me, I'm an enormous extrovert, like off the charts level extrovert, none of this like combination stuff. And I just miss people. I miss having lots of my mates over for dinner. I miss planning ridiculously over the top extravagant parties. I missed large groups of people. I missed performing to large crowds because that's somewhere I really draw my energy. I'm not someone who at the end of a performance feels sad and drained and quiet. I feel the opposite. I want to just talk to everyone and do it all over again. So that was a real challenge for me. But having said that, I can't stress enough how good we've had it. I have had it good with how well protected and safe and secure we've been able to be. And you know, for like a lot of young families, I think, whose the main hits on the family budget are housing costs and childcare. Removing the cost of childcare for a period was a huge bonanza. And there's been so many people that I've spoken to who across the income spectrum have talked about the impact that short period, which is about to end, of free childcare had, that it meant that parents could keep working, that it meant that children could keep receiving the quality early childhood education they deserved, and that those horrifically underpaid early childhood teachers could maintain their work as well. And I feel incredibly grateful for that, and furious at how quickly it's being removed and pulled back without a plan.
That does worry me. I want to go back to, you just painted not a rosy picture, but a picture where you recognized your privilege, and that although you and your family and your loved ones experienced the change that the rest of us did, you were still safe. I want to interrogate that a little bit, because like me, Jamila, you are a person who is ill and has chronic conditions that aren't going to go away. I have compromised immunity, and I am also very safe here writing out the pandemic, but I was really afraid for a few weeks because I would be one of those people who got really ill.
Yeah.
And you are in that category too. And I'd like your observations on, I mean, was that lonely? And how did the general population kind of deal with sick people at that time?
Yeah. I think at a purely personal level, I didn't feel particularly scared. I think I'd just gotten used to living with a degree of fear. I have a recurrent brain tumor and a number of chronic conditions that are a result of the brain surgeries that I've had. And so I think I'm just kind of used to that kind of life or death feeling and having that, which sounds really icky. But I think for that reason, I didn't feel terrified during the pandemic, but I did at the same time not go anywhere. I just stayed at home and sent my husband to the supermarket. So clearly there was a level of fear. I think what struck me during that period as a person with disabilities and chronic health conditions was how quickly and easily we were dismissed early on. The number of times I heard radio hosts, TV hosts, and even like friends and family and people in the community, my neighbors, say things like, yeah, it's all right, but like, to be honest, it really only affects like old people and sick people. So I just don't, you know, and it was almost like the end of that sentence is, we can afford to lose a few of those. I even appeared on the drum a few weeks ago when an economist from the Australian said exactly that. He was arguing that we have overreacted with the lockdown in Australia, that we have hurt the economy, and, you know, what would it have mattered if a couple more people who were sick, disabled or old died anyway? And containing my fury was quite difficult because I think it took a bit of adjustment to realize people were talking about me and speaking quite dismissively about me. And it was a reminder of how much we underestimate the contribution of people with serious illness and disability, and also how much this country underestimates the importance of learning from our older Australians. You know, accepting perhaps the Indigenous community, who have such a well-founded respect for elders, and parts of our migrant community where it's instilled that you respect those who come before and what they've learned. I think we can be pretty dismissive. It's a bit like, oh, yeah, you're done now. You're 80. We don't need you. Which is a really sad reflection, I think, on a bit of the Australian psyche. Because that was, I think, during those early weeks, particularly of the pandemic, it really felt like that was the resounding message I was hearing amongst people around my age, people in their early 30s.
That was the message that I heard as well. And while Australia as a whole has done pretty well, you know, with COVID-19 and the rates of infection that we have now, when we look at other countries like the United Kingdom that, you know, went for herd immunity and, you know, killing off everybody who was old and sick, it's gone really badly for them. So I'm glad we didn't take that path. But, you know, you look at social movements, Jamila, you hopefully see, you look at the stats and you see where we're going, or a better place that we could go. Where is that place? I mean, Bill Gates referred to pandemic 2, which terrifies me. But when we have pandemic 2, how can we do better? And how can we treat the elderly and the sick with more respect?
Oh my God, how long have you got? I mean, let's start with the fact that respect for scientists and people who deal in facts and data is at an all-time low globally, but particularly in Australia. We prefer someone with an opinion column like me appearing on the couch of a morning TV show talking about vaccinations. We prefer that person over a scientist who understands the science of vaccination. I think we don't value science in the way we should. It's clear in the underfunding of the CSIRO over many, many years. The CSIRO's program around pandemic preparedness was defunded just a few years ago. You know what I mean? Imagine if that investment had continued. Maybe we would have seen less deaths. Maybe we would have been able to open up our economy earlier, and we would have seen less people unemployed. We would have seen less people not being able to figure out how to make ends meet without enormous support from the government. I don't even know where to begin with the range of problems that I see, but also the opportunities. I truly hope, and it's probably a bit of false hope, but I hope that we start to see how certain groups within our community are undervalued, are discriminated against, and aren't thought about in public policy making in the way that they should, partly because they don't vote for a different party each election. I hope that we find a way to start leading with empathy, and for our politicians to speak with more empathy. One of the things I really did welcome during the pandemic was seeing the Prime Minister and others who I'm personally not a political fan of, but seeing their language start to shift to a bit of an we're all in this together, and having a little bit more compassion creep into what they were saying, rather than that kind of robotic, we live in an economy, not a society approach. And I don't know about you, but I feel like the last week or so, I haven't really thought beyond, in a political sense, what is going on in the United States right now with the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course what's happening here in Australia as well. And I think the bravery of watching people protest on the weekend, and protest as safely as they possibly could, as peacefully as they possibly could, but saying this issue is too important to stay at home, and this issue is killing people as well. Give me a moment. Rafi, come here. You can stay with me, but you need to stay quiet. Okay?
Welcome back, Rafi. We're almost done.
We're talking about books, but I bribed him with TV to stay away. You have to stay with me and have a quiet cuddle just while I finish talking to Astrid. Can you do that? No.
I need to tell you something.
No, honey, you don't need to tell me something. You need to wait.
I've got a question for your mum, Rafi.
Really important.
We're about to wind up, but my final question, Jamila, is are you working on anything else, and are you going to solve this problem for us all?
No, but there are smarter people than me that will take care of that. My problem at the moment is trying to make this one actually stay away while I get some work done in this world. I'm working on a whole bunch of stuff that I'm really excited about, including a book with future women and Penguin, which looks at telling the stories of women's resilience, and it's doing duck face, and learning from women who have survived pandemics, world wars, depressions before. We usually tell men's stories and glorify men's stories from those periods, and I have found a lot of faith and heart from being able to talk to women who have done what we are doing in a time that came before and who survived.
That sounds wonderful, and a book that I would like to read. Jamila, thank you so much for your time today. And Rafi, it has been lovely to see you.
Thank you for bearing with us, everybody. My TV bribe clearly did not work. I apologize, but thank you so much for having us.
Bye.